few days, thousands took to the streets in places like Minneapolis, Minnesota, to protest the fatal shooting of Amir Locke. 22-year-old Locke was shot when police were executing a no-knock warrant connected to a homicide investigation that he was not a suspect in. Amir did not have a criminal record, and it was less than 15 seconds from when officers opened the door before Officer Mark Hanneman shot Amir. Amir's death has been ruled a homicide, dying of multiple gunshot wounds. And some interesting information has come out. Like, 2 of those on the SWAT team to carry out this no-knock warrant were involved in another highly watched case. And the judge who signed off on that same warrant that led to Amir's death, though, is one we are all too familiar with. He is the judge from the Chauvin case. To update us on all this and more from Minnesota is journalist Georgia Fort. Georgia, thank you so much for making time to join us here on Roland Martin Unfiltered.
Pleasure to be here, Ray, and definitely wish it was under better circumstances.
Georgia, so let's ask some important questions to get started at the outset. We saw another weekend of protests, but for so many viewers and observers, their memories of Minneapolis protests was what we saw that kicked off the long, hot summer of 2020. What are you seeing on the ground from the people out in Minneapolis in the St. Paul area?
That's right, Ray. I was actually out there on Saturday afternoon when thousands were in the streets demanding justice for Amir Locke. And you pointed out some critical factors that are playing into the reason why so many people are turning out. The same judge who presided over the Derek Chauvin trial, Judge Cahill, is the one who signed off on this no-knock warrant. And so when we look at Chauvin and we look at the fact that he was fired, he was convicted, that instance was an outlier. This is not the norm in Minneapolis, right? And so what is the norm is that these systems are working together, not only the Minneapolis Police Department, but the BCA, the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which investigates when officers use fatal force in the state of Minnesota, and then also the judges. They're complicit as well. And so individuals are pointing now to the fact that nothing much has changed since the murder of George Floyd. Even though we had corporations saying that things were going to change, we had senators and we had people in Congress saying things were going to change. But here we are again, right in the same very city where it happened, and not much has changed. Activists and community leaders worked tirelessly over the last 2 years to try to get legislation passed, including a bill that would have addressed no-knock warrants. In light of what happened to Breonna Taylor, activists here were trying to be proactive and prevent something like what happened to Amir Locke from happening. There was 8 pieces of legislation that community leaders presented after George Floyd, and a lot of those bills were watered down, some of them not passed at all, including one about no-knock warrants. And so here we are, and the question that the city of Minneapolis is asking now is, why does the cost of change always have to come at the expense of Black blood?
And we saw on social media an intense exchange between the mayor and some reporters and or activists asking why Mr. Locke was initially labeled a suspect. There seems to be so much tension there. Are the activists in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area now looking at some systemic changes, or right now are the immediate responses from what you're hearing a need to change the head of interim police, a need to change mayor? Is it a change in the leadership of the individuals, or are folks down there now clamoring for a different type of system, a different type of governance?
No, I mean, that's a great question. And in fact, it was civil rights attorney Nikema Levy-Armstrong who stood up and called out interim chief of police Amelia Huffman, as well as Mayor Fry, for their press conference. And the reason being is because she's been on the ground even before George Floyd. She was organizing and demanding change for Jamar Clark, who was fatally shot before George Floyd. She actually ran for mayor. And so she has done her best to work together with leadership, with the politicians here. She is co-chairing one of the committees that the mayor put together to try to help bring forward change in public safety. And what she called out after Amir Locke was fatally shot was the fact that here we are again with the same rhetoric. And when you look at these police killings, it's not, I mean, obviously it's tragic when we lose someone at the hands of those who are supposed to protect and serve us. But in addition to that, there are some very fundamental things that go wrong, including the narrative that the police departments issue to the media and to the public about these incidences. And this is a reoccurrence. This is something that we saw happen after George Floyd was murdered. The Minneapolis Police Department published a press release saying that George Floyd had died of medical complications. Well, when you look at the footage from Darnella Frazier, you know that's not true. When you look at the determination Cahill made in the case, you know that's not true. And so the same thing here with Amir Locke. The Minneapolis Police Department held this press conference in front of the media, in front of the public, saying that he was a suspect. They said that he had a gun. They even published photos of his gun, but they failed to omit information about the fact that he had his license to have that gun. This is an American citizen with the Second Amendment right to bear arms. He legally had his gun registered. He did everything he was supposed to do. And at a time when this city is seeing, I think, a 60% increase in carjackings. This was a 22-year-old who was working for DoorDash, who was concerned that his car would be jacked, that he would be held at gunpoint. And so he went and he did the legal steps of getting a gun so he could protect himself. And so when you look at that, and then to circle back to the police department and the narrative that they portrayed, calling him a suspect, publishing the photographs of his gun without saying he had his license to have it. Then they also put this narrative out there that he was shot during a raid. But they didn't tell us that his name was not on the warrant. And so he was just there. He wasn't a suspect. So all of these things, what they did, Ray, they painted a picture that this was a criminal who deserved what happened to him. And when you actually look at the facts on this case, that is not the case at all. This was a law-abiding citizen who legally had his license to have this gun, and he was staying the night over someone else's house, and this raid just so happened to happen while he was there. And within 9 seconds, and not even when you really slow down the footage and you count, his parents, Andre Locke, his father, Andre Locke, and his mother, Karen Wells, have talked about how their son, their 22-year-old son, was a deep sleeper. And they came in, you can see the officers kick the couch that he's laying on. And at that moment is when he came to consciousness. That's when he woke up. So really, it was probably in the matter of 2 to 3 seconds that Officer Mark Hanneman made the fatal decision to shoot Amir Locke 3 times. And we can no longer, as the Black community, stand by and watch this stuff happen and not only try to hold these police departments accountable, but I believe the media is playing a critical role in the narratives that are being distributed to our society. And we have white individuals who say that this shooting was justified. But when you examine the facts of this case, this was a law-abiding citizen, and we should not have to continuously try to humanize Black men and women. We should not have to fight against these narratives. I've dedicated my entire career as an independent journalist to changing the narrative, because this is the perfect example where this innocent Black man has been criminalized.
Yeah, Georgia, you make a great point. And hang tight for 1 second, because I believe we have the video of that exchange that I earlier referenced regarding Mayor Jacob Fry in Minneapolis and the leader of their police department. So take a look.
That there is an ongoing tension between getting things out quickly and getting things right. We want to get things right. We want to, excuse me. We want to gather the necessary evidence to make sure that we are not telling you something that is inaccurate now, only to correct it a day later.
Why was Amir Locke referred to as a suspect?
And so I'm going to ask...
That's right. Why was Amir Locke referred to as a suspect in the MPD's press release? That's right.
I don't know. So can you speak to that?
Why was his gun pictures released?
So, but we could do one question at a time. We do want to answer the questions, but I would also prefer just to one question at a time. To your question, I do not know.
Does the chief know? Can the chief answer that question?
Go ahead.
So yesterday, at the time that we were putting out the press release, we didn't have as much information as we have now, of course. And so it's unclear, it was certainly unclear yesterday, but it remains unclear if or how Mr. Locke is connected to St. Paul's investigation. and more information will be coming as St. Paul digs further into the case.
Why did you refer to him as a suspect in a press release if you didn't know?
That's all the time we have, everyone. Let's call it.
No.
Was anyone apprehended as part of this?
Also,
When will you release the search warrant?
how is walking out of a press conference transparency? You are a murderer!
Seeing that tense exchange there, and for those viewers who may not have been able to hear clearly the audio, some of those in the crowd or in attendance were demanding answers as to why Mr. Locke was being called a suspect. In the initial press release, 4 different times, Minneapolis police referred to Mr. Locke as the suspect, the suspect, the suspect. But as your reporting indicates, Georgia, he was never a suspect. His name is not mentioned in the warrant. None of this is consistent. As an independent reporter, I don't necessarily want to ask you to offer your opinion as much as I am curious as how other reporters on the ground are taking information from those establishment figures in the authority and treating them as gospel, despite this long history of evidence we have both in Minneapolis and across the nation that the police are just as liable to sell them the story that will favor them as you or I might be if we were in a discrepancy with one another. How come so many reporters continue to take the word of law enforcement?
That's right. And we need to continue asking ourselves those questions. But that's why Roland's platform is so important. That's why the Black Star Network is so important, because we understand through our own lived experience in this country that the way it's been done is not the way that it can continue to be done, that there has to be systemic change. And so that's what I was referring to earlier when I was saying it's not just the fact that police officers are using fatal force. It's also the handling of the story after and the moments that follow and the narrative that's put out and the way that the media does treat that narrative by the police officers as though it is the gospel. At this point, the Minneapolis Police Department has shown it is not a reliable source for media outlets. So the process where, they release a press release and the mainstream media puts it out, that process needs to change. It needs to be re-examined. If we're going to have real equity, if we're going to have any inclination of justice in this country, we have to continuously examine these systems. And quite frankly, I think the media is just as responsible for the white Minnesotans who are showing up at protests, confronting activists, asking them, why are they out here? Because this man had a gun. Well, the reason why people are misinformed, it stems from the process. Minneapolis Police Department, this is the second time that they have issued inaccurate information. They should no longer be a trusted source for reporters or for media entities. So the same way that they vet sources, if mainstream media went into your community, they came and they talked to you and you told them facts or statistics, guess what they're going to do? They're going to vet that information. They're going to go back. They're going to fact check it before they share it with their audience. Well, they need to have that same microscope on the information that they're getting from the police departments, from politicians, from government agencies, because what we're seeing when it comes to our lives, when it comes to our humanity, they'll be quick to criminalize us and very, very slow to give us the benefit of the doubt, or even just look for the facts.
Yeah.
Amir Locke had his license to carry his gun.
Right.
And another question is, where is the NRA on this issue? You talk about the Second Amendment. If you, and even there was a gun expert who spoke recently at a press conference analyzing the footage, right? Go talk to a gun expert about that footage. And when you look at the way that Amir Locke he did pick up his gun because he was startled. He didn't know who was around him, but he didn't have it pointed at anybody. He didn't have his finger on the trigger. He had his finger along the barrel of the gun. And when you're trained on how to use a firearm, you are trained to assess the threat before you shoot. And so what that footage tells us, based on what we've heard from Marquis Armstrong, I believe is what his name was. He had his finger on the barrel. He had his thumb up. He had the gun pointed to the ground. He was assessing what was happening to him. This could have happened to anyone who has their license to have a gun. This could have happened to anyone. It could have been you. It could have been me. And unless there's an end to no-knock warrants, unless they examine this case very critically and think about the Second Amendment, we will see this happen again. It's very similar to what happened to Breonna Taylor. And here we are again.
Georgia, I want to bring my panel in, and I'm going to do so in just a second. But first, I want to ask you this question because you mentioned something that really caught my ear. You said there are white Minnesotans who are coming out to confront the activists who are protesting. And I'm curious if, from what you're seeing, are you concerned that we'll have a second incident like we saw in Kenosha, Wisconsin? Are the tensions that high, or is it actually civil dialogue that's happening out there?
I think at this point, it's hard to say. It hasn't even been a week. Amir Locke was fatally shot on Wednesday. I will say that, the protest that happened on Saturday for Amir Locke was probably the largest protest that this city has seen since the fatal shooting of Dante Wright, and so there definitely is a potential for this movement to grow. I do believe that. It is something that I'm continuing to follow, something I'm keeping a pulse on. At this time, it's hard to say. I think it truly depends on whether or not the officer ends up being fired. I think it depends on whether or not Amelia Huffman, who's the interim police chief, if she's terminated. And I also think it depends on whether or not the mayor steps down from his position. All of these things are things that the community is demanding, activists are demanding, and whether or not their demands are met, I think will determine the size of response that you'll see from this community.
Back to that Roland Mark unfiltered video in just one moment.
Time to be smart.
Roland Martin's doing this every day.
Oh, no punches!
Thank you, Roland Martin, for always giving voice to the issues.
Look for Roland Martin in the whirlwind, to quote Marcus Garvey again.
The video looks phenomenal, so I'm really excited to see it on my big screen.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and Black-owned media and something like CNN.
I got to defer to the brilliance of Dr. Carr and to the brilliance of the Black Star Network.
I am rolling with Roland all the way. Honored to be on a show that you own. A black man owns the show.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Like, Roland was amazing on there.
Stay black. I love y'all.
I can't commend you enough about this platform that you've created for us to be able to share who we are, what we're doing in the world, and the impact that we're having.
Let's be smart. Bring your eyeballs home.
You can't be Black-owned media and be scared. You dig?